There is a conversation you haven't finished yet, and another one you're already preparing for. Somewhere behind those, a decision you made this morning that you're still second-guessing, a prediction about how a difficult email will be received, and a version of tomorrow's meeting that you've already rehearsed at least 3 times. This is what Taoist philosophy calls an overcrowded mind, and the Zhuangzi, one of the foundational texts of that tradition, contains a practice for fasting it, not silencing it, not controlling it more tightly, something stranger and more precise than either of those. Before going any further, it's worth saying something honest about that phrase. Fasting an overcrowded mind is not ancient language. The Zhuangzi doesn't diagnose you as someone who has too many thoughts. The overcrowding metaphor is a modern bridge, a way of walking towards something older and more specific. What the text is actually concerned with is different. It's concerned with what happens when your established judgments, your rehearsed predictions, your fixed schemes for how things should go, begin to decide, in advance, what you are able to perceive. That's a subtler problem, and it turns out to be a harder one to solve. The difference matters because the obvious answer to mental noise is control. You assume the mind becomes clearer when it becomes more managed, when you plan better, when you anticipate more carefully, when you arrive at every situation already knowing what you're going to say. And that works, up to a point. The planning is real, the preparation is useful, but there's a cost that tends to go unexamined in Taoist philosophy, and the Zhuangzi circles it with unusual patience. The same mental command that helps you prepare can quietly begin to obstruct what you actually see. You stop encountering the room you walked into. You encounter the room you already expected. If you're watching or listening right now, I'd love to know where in the world you are and what time it is there. Just drop it in the comments, wherever your day or night finds you. Think of it this way. Imagine you're walking into a difficult conversation with someone close to you. Before they've said a word, you've already run several versions of the exchange. You know the arguments they're likely to use. You've prepared answers to those arguments. You've predicted how they'll respond to your answers. By the time the actual conversation begins, there's a version of it already running in your head, and it's loud, and it's detailed, and it's yours. None of that is irrational. But the Zhuangzi would ask, at what point does that internal rehearsal stop helping you respond and start preventing you from listening? At what point does your prepared version of the conversation become more real to you than the one that's actually unfolding? This is what the Zhuangzi means by excessive internal command. Not too many thoughts in the way that a crowded room has too many chairs, but something more like a room so thoroughly arranged in advance that there's no longer any open space for something unexpected to enter. The image of a room is useful here, and the Zhuangzi actually uses one, though we'll come back to that in detail. For now, what matters is the basic shape of the problem. It is not that thinking is the enemy. The Zhuangzi is not asking for an empty mind in the sense of a switched-off mind. Modern scholars who read the text carefully tend to emphasize this point, that what's being questioned is rigid or dominating cognition, not deliberation itself. The problem is a specific kind of mental insistence, the insistence on directing everything, on deciding in advance what you will find, on arriving at every moment already knowing what it means. There is a paradox buried in that, and the Zhuangzi builds its teaching around it. Intelligence can prepare you, but the same intelligence, carried past a certain point, can close you off from what's actually present. More command does not always mean more clarity. Sometimes it means less. That is not the kind of thing that fits easily into how most people think about mental effort. It doesn't fit into how you were probably taught to handle difficulty. The answer the Zhuangzi offers is not better planning. It isn't a technique for emptying your head. It begins with a conversation between a young man named Yan Hui and a teacher he trusts. And it begins because Yan Hui believes, with complete confidence, that he already knows exactly what he needs to do. The instruction to fast the heart-mind, appears not in a quiet retreat, not in a moment of personal stillness, but in a story about entering one of the most dangerous situations a person could face: a volatile political court, a ruler resistant to correction, and a young man who believes he knows exactly how to handle it. The scene comes from Chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi, traditionally titled Ren Jian Shi, rendered in English variously as In the Human World or In the World of Men. It's a chapter concerned with how a person moves through difficult human environments without being destroyed by them or becoming the source of further harm. And it opens with Yan Hui standing before his teacher, ready to leave. Yan Hui has heard about the state of Wei. Its ruler is portrayed in the narrative as self-directed, resistant to any voice but his own, and indifferent to the suffering his governance is causing. Yan Hui finds this intolerable. He is not naive. He has thought carefully about what he'll say and how he'll say it. He has prepared arguments. He has considered approaches. He is morally serious and genuinely concerned. And so he announces his intention to go. What he expects, perhaps, is some form of recognition. What he receives instead is a question, then another, then another. In the Zhuangzi's literary dialogue, and it's important to say that clearly, because this is philosophical literature using historical figures as characters, not a transcript of an actual recorded exchange between the historical Confucius and the historical Yan Hui. The teacher the text calls Zhuangzi, a name associated with Confucius, does not praise Yan Hui's moral courage and send him on his way. He begins to probe. What will you say to the ruler? Yan Hui offers his first approach. The teacher identifies its weakness. What else? Yan Hui offers another. That one, too, is examined and found insufficient, not because the ideas are wrong in themselves, but because each one assumes too much. Each strategy already contains a fixed picture of how the situation will unfold, a predetermined shape that the encounter is expected to fill. And a ruler who does not want to be corrected will not follow anyone's predetermined shape. This is the heart of what the Zhuangzi is pressing toward. The problem isn't that Yan Hui cares, or that he's thought about the situation, or that he wants to help. The problem is that his preparation has already closed certain doors. He arrives at each proposed method already knowing what he intends to find, already knowing how the ruler will respond, already positioned to confirm rather than to perceive. His plans are sincere, but sincerity is not the same as responsiveness. Scholars who have read this passage carefully tend to describe the teaching this way. What becomes dangerous in Yan Hui's situation is not moral engagement, but entering that engagement governed by rigid prior commitments. The point is not that he should abandon his concern for the people of Wei or stop thinking about how to speak. The point is that alert responsiveness to the actual, shifting conditions of a volatile encounter requires something that a fully prepared script cannot provide. A person may still carry a sense of direction into a difficult situation, as one reading of this passage suggests, while remaining genuinely open to how that direction needs to move once things begin. One strategy fails, then another, and at some point, Yan Hui runs out of approaches. He admits it. He has nothing else to propose, and asks what remains to be done. It's worth sitting with that moment. Not because defeat is the lesson, but because it's precisely here, when the prepared methods have been exhausted, when the confidence in one's own scheme has been quietly dissolved, that the teaching becomes possible. The answer Yan Hui receives is not a better strategy. It is not an improved argument or a more refined technique for reaching a difficult ruler. It is a single, unexpected word: fast. Yan Hui's first reaction is almost disarming in its simplicity. He hears the word fast, and he understands it in the ordinary way. He explains that because his household is poor, he has already gone for months without wine and certain rich or restricted foods. By that measure, he has been fasting for some time. The image is almost humble enough to miss: an empty bowl, a sparse table, a man who thinks the instruction has already been fulfilled. But the teacher immediately separates this from what he means. That kind of abstinence belongs to ritual or sacrificial fasting. The Zhuangzi is pointing toward something else. It gives that something a name, Xinzhai, written with the characters for Xin and fasting. In English, the phrase is commonly rendered as fasting the heart-mind, fasting the mind, or in closely related ways. None of those translations is perfect, because the first word, Xin, carries more than the English word mind usually suggests. Xin is not simply the part of you that calculates, reasons, or produces thoughts. In early Chinese philosophy, it can involve thinking, feeling, desire, intention, judgment, and the direction in which a person is inwardly leaning. Heart-mind can sound unusual in English, but it preserves something important. The thing being fasted is not merely an intellectual machine inside the head. It is the whole inner center from which you interpret, prefer, intend, reject, anticipate, and orient yourself toward what is happening. That changes the metaphor. If Xinzhai meant simply reducing the number of thoughts in consciousness, Yan Hui's political problem would become strangely irrelevant. But the teaching appears precisely after his methods have failed. His heart-mind is not crowded because he possesses too much information. It is crowded because it is already occupied by ways of approaching the ruler, ideas about what should happen, judgments about what kind of man the ruler is, and assumptions about how correction must work. The fast, therefore, begins to look less like deprivation and more like loosening the grip of what has already taken possession of the inner space. Think again of the empty bowl. Its emptiness does not make it useless. The emptiness is what allows it to receive something. In the same way, the word fasting begins to suggest a reduction, not of intelligence itself, but of the constant inward feeding of preference, certainty, rehearsed intention, and automatic interpretation. This is why translating Xinzhai as mind fasting can be helpful only if you remember what kind of mind the passage is talking about. It is not telling you to damage thought, distrust reason, or become vacant. It is asking what happens when the heart-mind stops consuming only what it already knows. There is also a historical caution worth keeping in view. This teaching appears in Chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi, one of the 7 chapters traditionally called the inner chapters. The text we now call the Zhuangzi is not a single securely authored book in the modern sense. It is a compilation with different authorial layers. The received edition contains 33 chapters, 7 inner chapters, 15 outer chapters, and 11 miscellaneous chapters. That arrangement comes through the edition associated with Guoxiang, who died in 312 CE, centuries after the intellectual world in which the earliest Zhuangzian material emerged. The earlier collection available in that later history reportedly contained 52 chapters. Because the inner chapters have often been treated as especially close to the earliest Zhuangzian thought, it has sometimes been tempting to speak as though every line in them came directly from the historical Zhuangzhou. But that cannot be demonstrated with certainty. Chapter 4 belongs to the inner chapters traditionally associated most closely with Zhuangzi, although direct authorship remains uncertain. That distinction matters because the safest language is not that Zhuangzi personally invented Xinzhai, but that the teaching appears in the Zhuangzi and belongs to the early philosophical world preserved within it. And that early world gives the metaphor its force. Fasting normally removes something you habitually take in. Xinzhai turns that image inward. What is being reduced is not necessarily thought itself, but the dominance of the inner patterns through which experience is immediately sorted and controlled. The heart-mind can become so full of its own directions that it has no room left for direction from the situation itself. The Zhuangzi does not leave this as a vague spiritual image. After distinguishing ordinary fasting from fasting of the heart-mind, the passage becomes more precise. It begins to describe different ways of receiving what is in front of you. First, through the ears. then through Xin, and finally, through something the text calls qi. Qi is where the teaching becomes more difficult to translate, because the passage is not offering a modern theory of the nervous system or a hidden biological mechanism. It is using its own philosophical language. And before Yan Hui is told to listen with qi, the instruction begins with something that may sound almost opposite to emptiness. Make your intention one. That detail matters. The movement toward receptivity does not begin with scattering attention in every direction. It begins with a certain unity. Then the Zhuangzi describes a progression in how the world is received. Listen. First, not merely with the ears. Then not merely with the heart-mind. Finally, listen with qi. The ears seem straightforward. A sound reaches you. A voice crosses the small distance between two people. You hear the words. But hearing alone is limited to what the ears can receive. The deeper difficulty begins a moment later, when Xin takes over. Imagine sitting across from someone during a difficult conversation. The other person says one sentence. Your ears hear it clearly, yet before the sentence has fully settled, your heart-mind has already begun its work. You recognize a familiar tone. You connect it with something said weeks ago. You decide what the person really means. Perhaps you prepare your defense before the next sentence arrives. The sound is new. The interpretation may not be. This is close to the problem the passage identifies. Xin can become arrested at recognition, at the act of fitting what arrives into patterns already available to it. Something happens, and almost immediately the heart-mind asks, what is this like? What does this confirm? Where does this belong? Is this favorable or unfavorable? Does it support what I expected? Recognition is not useless. Without it, ordinary life would be almost impossible. The Zhuangzi is not asking you to become incapable of identifying anything. The difficulty appears when recognition stops serving perception and begins ruling it. Then you no longer meet the situation only as it is developing. You also meet the accumulated structure of what you already expect it to be. That is why the passage's movement toward qi is so striking. Qi is described here in connection with emptiness, as something that waits for things. It does not mean that nothing is present. It points toward a mode of receptivity that is not immediately forcing what arrives into a predetermined shape. You can feel the contrast without turning it into a scientific model. In one state, you hear another person's words while silently building your reply. Every phrase is processed through the argument you brought into the room. In another, there is a slight opening before conclusion. You still hear. You still understand. You still have experience, memory, and judgment. But for a moment, the incoming situation is allowed to reveal something that your prepared interpretation did not predict. The Zhuangzi often questions the assumption that the heart-mind should act as the permanent executive center of the whole person, issuing commands while everything else simply obeys. Some scholarly interpretations of this passage suggest a different possibility. The embodied field described through qi can participate in skillful responsiveness, rather than leaving every movement under the tight supervision of conscious deliberation. That makes the contrast with some strands of early Confucian thought useful, though it should remain brief. In texts associated with Zhuangzi, the heart-mind can be described more clearly as directing or leading bodily qi. The Zhuangzi often seems less comfortable with that fixed hierarchy. What if the heart-mind does not always need to stand above experience as its commander? What if guidance can also emerge through a more distributed responsiveness to the situation itself? This does not make qi equivalent to electricity in the body, brain activity, nervous system regulation, or any other modern measurable process. Those comparisons would add claims the ancient passage does not establish. Here, it is better to remain inside the conceptual world of the text. Qi marks a movement away from the heart-mind's tendency to capture experience through established recognition and towards something more open, more responsive, less immediately occupied by its own conclusions. The change can be almost imperceptible. A voice is heard. The familiar judgment begins to rise, but before it completely fills the space, there is a pause, not necessarily a long one, and not an empty lapse in awareness. Just enough room for the possibility that this moment is not identical to the last one. That is where the image of the inner room begins to change. Its emptiness is not the absence of perception, it is availability. The question now becomes much more precise. What kind of emptiness could leave you more awake to what is happening, rather than less? The emptiness in Xinzhai is not a darkened consciousness. Yan Hui is being prepared to notice more, not less. That becomes clearer when the passage links the Tao with emptiness, and identifies emptiness with the fasting of the heart-mind. The language can sound abstract, until the Zhuangzi gives you an image, an empty room in which brightness can arise. It is not necessary to treat that image as supernatural. Its force is simpler than that. A room that is already filled from wall to wall has little space left for anything new. A room with open space can receive. The same distinction applies inwardly. An empty heart-mind is not one that has stopped functioning. It is one that is not completely occupied in advance. It has not already filled the entire room with conclusions, preferences, rehearsed answers, and fixed interpretations before the next moment arrives. That matters because Yan Hui is not being trained to disappear from life. He is preparing to enter Wei, a difficult human environment in which the smallest change in tone, timing, or circumstance may matter. If emptiness meant simple mental blankness, it would make him less capable of dealing with that situation, not more. But the dramatic setting points in the opposite direction. The teaching asks for a kind of openness that can remain alert while conditions change. This is why some scholars describe Xinzhai as involving a reduction in the force of personal preferences, together with greater sensitivity to changing tendencies. That is an interpretation, rather than a mechanical definition. But it captures something important in the passage. The less completely your own preferred outcome occupies the inner space, the more room there may be to notice what the situation is actually doing. Imagine a room in the early morning. The floor is clear. Nothing dramatic happens. Light enters because nothing is blocking the opening. The image is useful precisely because emptiness is not presented as dead space. It is the condition that allows something to appear. The same thing can happen in a conversation. You may still have an opinion. You may still know what you want to say. You may even believe strongly that the other person is mistaken. But if your conclusion has already filled every corner of attention, then almost anything they say will be forced into the shape you prepared. If there is even a little room left open, something unexpected can register before it is judged. That is closer to the kind of receptivity the Zhuangzi is moving toward. Not passivity, not mental disappearance, not the elimination of thought. The passage asks for emptiness, but scholars generally interpret that emptiness as heightened receptivity, rather than simple mental blankness. There is, however, an important scholarly disagreement about how literally we should understand Xinzhai as a practice in the earliest Zhuangzi. Some scholars read the sequence of instructions, unifying intention, moving beyond ordinary hearing and heart-mind recognition, turning toward qi and emptiness, as evidence of an early contemplative discipline. On that reading, the passage may preserve something practical and cultivated, not merely a poetic description. Other scholars are more cautious. They argue that the earliest Zhuangzi may be describing primarily a condition of cultivated responsiveness rather than laying out a clearly defined meditation technique in the later sense. Later Taoist traditions would develop and adopt this language more explicitly as cultivation language, but that later history should not simply be projected backward. So the safest conclusion is also the most useful one. Xinzhai may have practical dimensions. It may describe something cultivated, but the text does not give us permission to turn it into a standardized ancient meditation protocol with precise steps and guaranteed results. The philosophical center is clearer than the historical classification. The heart-mind becomes less occupied by itself, so that it can become more responsive to what is actually there. This also helps explain why the word empty can be misleading in modern English. We often hear emptiness as lack, no content, no purpose, no thought. But in the Zhuangzi's image, emptiness has another quality. It makes reception possible. A doorway is useful because it is open. A bowl is useful because part of it is unfilled. A room can receive light because space remains within it. The heart-mind, in the same spirit, does not become wiser by becoming inert. It becomes more available when it stops insisting that every new event must fit an old conclusion. And once you see emptiness this way, another question becomes difficult to avoid. If the room of the heart-mind becomes crowded so easily, what usually fills it first? Very often, it is judgment. Judgment can arrive so quickly that it feels like perception itself. Someone says a few ordinary words, and before the sentence has fully landed, you already know what it means. You know why they said it. You know what kind of person they are being. You know what will happen next. That speed can be useful. Human life depends on recognition. You cannot reconsider everything from the beginning, each time you enter a room or speak with someone you know. But the Zhuangzi repeatedly becomes interested in the moment when recognition hardens into something more powerful. A fixed distinction, a settled this and not this. A conclusion that begins organizing experience before experience has had time to unfold. This is where an overcrowded heart-mind can become misleading. It does not need 100 thoughts. Sometimes one thought is enough. One judgment can fill the entire room if everything that follows must pass through it. Think of a family disagreement that has repeated for years. One person begins speaking, and an old role appears instantly. The selfish one, the difficult one, the one who never listens. Perhaps there are reasons that judgment formed. Xinzhai does not require pretending history never happened. But once the label becomes absolute, every new sentence can be heard as further evidence for something already decided. Even a different response may be interpreted through the same old story. Something similar can happen at work. You enter a meeting expecting criticism. A colleague asks a neutral question. The words themselves may be simple, but the heart-mind has already prepared a category. Challenge, doubt, disapproval. The question enters, and recognition snaps shut around it before other possibilities can be considered. Or consider an unresolved relationship. A message arrives later than expected. A pause lasts a little too long. Nothing has yet been explained, but an entire interpretation begins assembling itself from memory. The silence means distance. The delay means rejection. The familiar story returns so quickly that it may feel less like interpretation than fact. The Zhuangzi's concern with learned judgments and this, not this distinctions helps explain why Xinzhai reaches beyond simple mental quiet. Our perspectives are shaped by what we have lived through, what we value, what we fear, and what we have already concluded. Modern scholars often describe one part of Zhuangzian thought in terms of epistemic modesty, the recognition that your perspective is a perspective, not an absolute view from nowhere. That does not mean every judgment is false, and it does not mean all interpretations are equally good. The Zhuangzi does not simply condemn conscious thought or discernment. The problem is domination. A judgment becomes dangerous when it stops being one possible reading and becomes the only reading experience is allowed to confirm. Yan Hui's situation makes this concrete. He does not enter the discussion about Wei without moral concern or strategic thought. His difficulty is that his categories have become too settled. He already knows what kind of ruler he is facing. He already knows what kind of correction should work. He already knows what he intends to accomplish. The teacher's challenge is not to erase those concerns, but to prevent them from becoming so dominant that Yan Hui can no longer respond to minute changes in the situation itself. This is why responsiveness requires more than having a good plan. A strategy may remain, preparation may remain, discernment may remain, but implementation must stay open enough to change when the conditions change. That distinction is easy to miss, because control often feels like clarity. The more certain you are about what something means, the less confused you feel. But certainty can sometimes purchase that comfort by reducing what you are willing to notice. You can see the difference in a small moment. Someone you know well makes a comment you have heard many times before. The old interpretation rises immediately. Then, before you answer, something slightly different becomes visible. The tone is softer. The timing is unusual. The person hesitates. A detail that would have disappeared inside the old judgment now has somewhere to land. Nothing mystical has happened. The world has not become vague. In fact, it may have become more specific. That is the deeper shift. Xinzhai does not ask you to lose discernment. It loosens the monopoly of predetermined discernment. It leaves enough room for the possibility that this person, this moment, this conversation may not be identical to the one you already know. And once judgment no longer has to command every response, a new question appears. If rigid control steps back, what guides action instead? The Zhuangzi answers that question not with passivity, but with skill. Skill in the Zhuangzi is rarely about tighter control. It is about becoming responsive enough that action no longer needs to force its way through every moment. Cook Ding offers a clear parallel. His story is not a definition of Xinzhai, but it reveals the same Taoist suspicion. Conscious control can become clumsy when it insists on directing what cultivated responsiveness could handle more naturally. Cook Ding does not succeed by overpowering what is before him. He follows the structure he encounters. A forceful approach says reality must fit the path already chosen. A responsive approach notices where resistance increases, where space opens, and where movement becomes possible. That is why less control does not have to mean chaos. You can prepare carefully for a meeting and still discover that the conversation moves somewhere unexpected. If you cling to the exact sequence you planned, every new question feels like a disruption. But if preparation gives you direction rather than a cage, you can adjust without losing your purpose. The same principle appears in skilled work. Someone who knows a material well does not simply impose a plan. Pressure changes, texture changes, resistance changes. The skilled person notices and responds. Their action can become more precise because it follows what is actually there. This is where the Zhuangzi's skilled action stories meet the logic of Xinzhai. The heart-mind does not vanish, but it no longer needs to command every movement. Some scholarly interpretations describe embodied qi as participating in responsiveness, allowing guidance to emerge from the situation rather than from conscious deliberation alone. This also helps clarify Wu Wei. It is often misunderstood as doing nothing. Here, it is better understood as letting go of strained, coercive, or forced action, so that responsiveness can emerge. Consider a difficult conversation. You know what you need to say. You prepare the main point. Then the other person says something you did not expect. If your plan has become a command, you may ignore what they actually said and continue toward the response you rehearsed. If the plan stays flexible, their words can change your response. You still know why you entered the conversation. You are simply no longer forcing it through a route chosen in advance. That is not passivity, and it is not impulse. The Zhuangzi's skilled action stories involve cultivation and practice. Spontaneity does not mean doing whatever first appears in the mind. Often, the first reaction is only another old pattern. Responsive action remains sensitive to the structure of the moment. This brings us back to the empty room. The room is not empty because nothing can happen there. Its openness is what allows movement. If every part of the floor were occupied, only one path would remain. Leave space, and direction can change. Xinzhai, skill, and Wu Wei should not be treated as identical ideas, but they share a family resemblance. Xinzhai loosens the heart-mind's need to occupy everything in advance. Skilled action shows what cultivated responsiveness can look like. Wu Wei points away from strained and coercive action. Together, they challenge a common fear. If control relaxes, everything will fall apart. The Zhuangzi suggests that some forms of control create their own disorder because they cannot adapt. They keep pressing forward even after conditions change. A skilled person can stop, adjust, follow an opening, use less force when force would only create resistance. That family resemblance helps explain why Xinzhai remained meaningful in later Taoist cultivation. And as centuries passed, similarities around emptiness, spontaneity, and reduced interference would invite comparison with later Buddhist and Zen traditions. But that belongs to a different historical world. That later history matters because mind fasting did not remain an isolated phrase. Later Taoist traditions adopted Xinzhai as language of cultivation, and they also made use of another Zhuangzi expression, zuo, often translated as sitting and forgetting. The resemblance between the two can be tempting. Both can be associated with loosening ordinary patterns of self-directed control, but they appear in different passages of the Zhuangzi and should not be treated as synonyms. Their later histories overlap without becoming identical. This also brings back an important uncertainty. Some scholars read Xinzhai and related passages as evidence that early Taoist texts were already describing recognizable contemplative practices. The sequence of unified intention, reduced reliance on ordinary modes of listening, qi, and emptiness, can certainly be read that way. Others are more cautious. They argue that the earliest Zhuangzi may be describing primarily a cultivated state of responsiveness, rather than naming a clearly defined meditation method. Later Taoist traditions developed these terms more explicitly as cultivation language, but that later development does not prove that the earliest text already contained the same formal practice. The distinction matters because old ideas often become easier to understand once later traditions give them familiar shapes. But those shapes can also hide historical distance. That is especially true when Xinzhai is compared with Zen. The comparison is understandable. The Zhuangzi speaks about emptiness, reduced interference, responsiveness, and forms of action that are not dominated by strained control. Centuries later, Chinese Chan Buddhism would also develop teachings in a cultural world where questions of spontaneity, attachment, direct experience, and emptiness had become deeply important. Zhuangzi thought helped shape the wider Chinese intellectual environment in which Chan later developed. But Chan arose centuries after the warring states world of the Zhuangzi, within Buddhist doctrines, practices, and institutions of its own. So Xinzhai should not simply be called an early Zen practice. Later Chan developed in a Chinese world already deeply influenced by texts, such as the Zhuangzi, but resemblance is not identity. A similar word such as emptiness can carry different meanings inside different traditions. The same is true of spontaneity, silence, or reduced attachment to fixed thought. Similar language does not erase different histories. Protecting those differences actually makes the comparison more interesting. Instead of imagining one timeless doctrine passing unchanged from Taoism into Zen, you can see a long conversation unfolding across centuries. Ideas enter new settings. Old images acquire new meanings. Later communities recognize something useful in earlier texts, without simply becoming those earlier texts. Modern comparisons add another layer. Some scholars have compared Xinzhai with meditation, forms of attention, or cognitive flexibility. These parallels can help modern readers understand why the ancient teaching still feels recognizable, but they remain interpretations, and the empirical evidence sometimes brought into such discussions is mixed. For the same reason, Xinzhai should not be presented as ancient neuroscience, ancient mindfulness, in a modern technical sense, or a proven treatment for anxiety or other clinical conditions. The historical evidence does not establish any of those claims. Its value does not depend on them. The teaching can remain philosophically powerful without being converted into medicine or modern psychology. Its question is already difficult enough. What happens when your own preferences, expectations, and settled interpretations stop filling the whole field of attention? Later Taoists found reasons to preserve that question. Later Buddhist traditions developed different answers to related human problems. Modern readers continue to recognize something familiar in both. But the original image becomes clearer when those later labels are gently set aside. You are left again with Yan Hui, preparing to enter an uncertain situation. He cannot know every response in advance. He cannot guarantee that his plan will fit what he encounters. He can only avoid allowing what he already believes to occupy all the space before the encounter begins. And from there, the ancient teaching returns to something remarkably simple: leaving enough room for what has not happened yet. Leaving room for what has not happened yet may be the simplest way to understand Xinzhai. To fast an overcrowded heart-mind is not to empty yourself of intelligence. It is to stop forcing each new moment to fit conclusions formed before it arrived. You can still prepare. You can still judge. You can still think carefully. What changes is their authority. They no longer become the only interpretation reality is allowed to confirm. Imagine entering a difficult conversation with a response already prepared. Then the other person says something unexpected. Their tone shifts. They reveal something you did not know. The situation itself changes. You can continue along the route you rehearsed, or you can let the new information matter. Your purpose remains. Your intelligence remains. But the response changes because reality has been allowed into the process. The same principle appears in a decision you have prepared carefully. A new fact arrives. If the plan has become a command, changing course feels like failure. If it remains a tool, adjustment becomes possible. This is where the Taoist quality of the teaching becomes clear. Wu Wei is not a refusal to act. Here it points away from coercive action, from forcing every situation into a predetermined shape. Xinzhai supports that movement by loosening the heart-mind's demand to decide everything in advance. That does not guarantee the right choice. Receptivity is not certainty in another form. The Zhuangzi repeatedly challenges confidence in the completeness of one's own perspective. Leaving room for reality means accepting that what you currently see may not be the whole picture. You can hold a strong judgment without treating it as the entire landscape. You can follow a strategy while remaining willing to revise it. You can act decisively while noticing when the conditions have changed. That brings us back to Yan Hui. The teaching is given to someone preparing to enter uncertainty, not escape from it. In the literary dialogue, he is moving toward a difficult human situation where fixed methods may fail. Xinzhai does not reject engagement or thought. It questions predetermined control. The passage connects qi with emptiness and openness, Tao with emptiness, and emptiness with the fasting of the heart-mind. Yet this emptiness serves alert responsiveness. It is better understood as heightened receptivity than as simple blankness, and overcrowded mind remains a modern bridge. The ancient passage does not diagnose the problem as simply having too many thoughts. A historically safer comparison is the pressure created by rehearsed judgments, predictions, preferences, and plans when they begin deciding what you can perceive before events have finished unfolding. Mental crowding is not always noisy. Sometimes it sounds like certainty. You already know what the other person means. You already know how the meeting will go. You already know what a silence means. The room may contain only one conclusion, but if that conclusion fills every corner, nothing new can enter. The Taoist response is not to destroy thought or force the mind into vacancy. It is subtler. Leave something unoccupied. A judgment can remain without becoming a prison. A plan can remain without becoming a command. A memory can remain without forcing the present to repeat it. This is why the empty room image matters. Imagine the door opening. Nothing has been erased. There is simply enough open space for air to move and light to enter. That is availability, not vacancy. Xinzhai is not historically established as a clinical treatment for anxiety or other forms of mental distress. Its value here is philosophical and spiritual. It offers a way of examining how control, judgment, and expectation can shape perception and response. You do not need to become thoughtless. You do not need to stop caring. You do not need to abandon preparation. The challenge is smaller and perhaps harder. Let what happens have some authority too. Let a conversation change your prepared reply. Let a new fact change your decision. Let today's person differ from the person you remember. Let the present refuse to fit the conclusion you brought into it. The heart-mind still participates. It simply stops occupying the whole room. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of fasting here. Not starving the mind of thought, but loosening its hunger for certainty, prediction, and control. Enough space remains for response. Enough space remains for surprise. Enough space remains for what has not yet happened. The room is not empty of life. It is empty enough to receive it.